Welcome, everyone. My name is Jennifer Guittard, and I have the privilege of serving as program co-chair of IPAC Nova Scotia. And on behalf of my colleagues at the Institute of Public Administration of Canada, I'm very pleased to welcome you all here for what will be an exciting peek behind the curtain for an insider's look at the Centre of Canadian Government. We'll be taking your questions throughout tonight's event, and if you have a question that you'd like to ask Michael, please enter it into the chat on YouTube. Towards the end of the discussion, we'll reserve some time to bring in audience questions. Finally, I'd like to introduce our moderator for this evening's fireside chat, Matt Campbell, who is a manager in Deloitte's Public Service Transformation Practice and the second vice president of the Institute of the Public Administration of Canada, and of course, past chair of IPAC Nova Scotia. Matt, over to you to introduce our special guest.
Hey, thanks so much, Jennifer. Really happy to be here. And I think I'll keep the introduction short because everyone knows who you are, Michael. So, Michael, for the benefit of the archives, you were the 23rd clerk of the Privy Council, secretary to cabinet, deputy minister to 4 different ministers, we learned in the book. And the book, of course, Governing Canada, A Guide to the Tradecraft of Politics, which really excited that it did sell out its first printing. So congratulations.
Thank you.
I understand the second wave is just hitting bookstores this week. So lots of time for folks to pick up their copy before the holidays. I think what some viewers might not know is that this isn't your first published work. You were one of the prime authors of the Charlton Accord, which sold 11. Well, I guess it didn't sell it, but there were 11 million copies printed and distributed to Canadian households. So I suspect it'll be tough to top that in terms of circulation, although we'll certainly give it a try. So thanks for having us on your book tour.
Well, thanks for your interest, and hello everybody. Bonjour, Kwe and Nusukut. I'm delighted to have so much interest in the book.
So last time we met, Michael, you were in Halifax. It was January 2020. We were driving around in a Mini Cooper. We booked a little theater and had an event, and COVID-19 was still just a regional news story in China. Lots has changed, of course. How have you been spending your time over the past 2 years, nearly 2 years?
Well, I retired in April of 2019, and I had sort of the usual post-retirement plans to do a bit of traveling. We got around to that, and in early 2020, and it all went out the window. So there's still, these are deferred ambitions now, still to get to Europe and to get to some other places. That was the main thing. I've been able to do, a little bit of teaching, a little bit of consulting, and essentially through this format. Writing the book was obviously, just me and a computer last winter. And then it's been interesting to do a national book tour, with media interviews and radio and webinars and seminars, and I haven't left this desk. It's very 2021.
No kidding. So the book's been described as an owner's guide and not a kiss and tell. So when I think about clerks writing books after they wrap up their role, I think about Gordon Robertson's memoirs of a civil servant, full of anecdotes. But this is really like a different format. So I wonder, because we didn't get to know kind of you, maybe we could take a couple minutes to get to know you, and I can kind of fire a few rapid questions your way. So I got about a dozen.
At the risk of losing your audience, go ahead.
Okay, your favorite season?
Fall.
Favorite subject in school?
History.
Cat person or dog person?
Dog.
Yeah. Your favorite musician or musical group?
Baby Boomer Rock, Rolling Stones.
Okay, and your go-to karaoke song?
Oh, it'll probably be one of the Stone songs.
And your go-to lazy dinner, if you've got 20 minutes to make it?
Pardon?
If you had to cook dinner, what's your go-to recipe?
Oh, I'm a summer barbecue guy, basically.
Yeah. The best series, and this is a very pandemic question, the best series you binge watched over the past couple of years?
Ooh, that's a tough one. A lot of good ones. I really liked Call My Agent, the French one, and We're into Succession right now. I watched 73 episodes of Breaking Bad last winter. All this, there's so many. So.
No kidding. Is Succession worth the hype?
I think it's entertaining, but it has a lot of plot holes in it. It's hard to believe some of this would happen. So,
great. 4 more. Your least favorite part about working from home?
I used to very much enjoy the people contact. I think everybody has gone through some version of that. There's no question that working, teaching, and doing things online has been productive. And it's incredible how people have made the adaptation, whether they're journalists or public servants or politicians or judges or whatever. But there is something to be said for that, human and social contact, or running into people and around the fringes and edges of meetings, or just keeping tabs, and certainly miss that people contact.
Gotcha. 3 more in our rapid fire round. Favorite place to grab a coffee near Landryman Block?
I was pretty lazy, actually. I think I used to just go to the one at the nearest corner, which I think was a Tim's for a long time. It may have turned over since then.
Okay. 2 more. Favorite place in Canada outside of Ottawa, of course?
Oh, that's a tough one. I have been through my career to every single province and every single territory more than once. And that's something I'm very pleased with. I think going north was special. I got to Yukon and the Northwest Territories and Nunavut, and I think seeing places like Pond Inlet and was really special.
Yeah. And last one, favorite prime minister?
I think I'll have to opt out and say Mackenzie King or something. I don't want to offend any of the current incumbents.
So, okay, great. Now we know you. We can talk about the book and get the audience back. So let's talk about the book and the drafting process, and maybe we can kind of start, if you want to bring us back to how you came to the decision to kind of sit down and write a book. So what was kind of the thought process?
Well, I played a role as one of the senior members of the federal deputy community. You just keep showing up for work and you end up being one of the senior leaders. And I'd often been invited to do, teaching events or learning events, either through the Canada School of Public Service or university classes. I'd been invited specifically to talk about this realm of, being effective in cabinet government at retreats of ministers. I talked at professional development days for political staffers a couple of times. I appeared on a panel with my minister and my chief of staff at my side during the Harper government. And I was often deputy orientations and that sort of thing. And I was being asked a lot about these issues, about what is it these people do all day? What does it take to be more effective? I was really struck picking up one of my ministers from Rideau Hall and going back to the office in Hull. And the thing that the minister really wanted to talk about was not files, but being a minister. He was joining a group that had already been at it for several years. He would be the new kid. And he wanted my advice on, how do I fit in and how do I be effective? So I realized there was something there to pass along. And I struggled for a long time trying to find the format. As you said earlier, I didn't really want to write one of those memoir style things full of look at me anecdotes. They always seem a bit self-serving. And frankly, the other reason I've said in other interviews is my best stories I'm never going to tell. It would just violate the confidentiality of the actual setting if you're across the table from a minister, or in a small group meeting with the prime minister, or inside the cabinet room. There's some really interesting things that I went through, but I'm not going to tell those stories because it would just violate the confidentiality of them. Not just for me, it's not something that I don't want to do, but I think this whole practice of running and doing memoirs that you see in London and Washington, it has a corrosive effect on trust. I don't think the prime minister should be sort of looking down the table and thinking, that man or woman in the corner is going to write a memoir about this. So, a lot of my stories are in the vault, but I did find a way, I hope, certainly the feedback suggests it works, to convey some of these things about the tradecraft, like the how, not the what government does, whether it's going to legalize cannabis or bring in a carbon price or, bring in a national childcare program. That takes care of itself in many ways. But the how to govern and the difference between governing and electoral politics was something that I thought I could make a bit of a contribution, especially to students of political science and public management, and anybody who's sort of interested in government, as this audience would be.
Yeah, and it is quite interesting. And my head did go there to the UK, because it seems like every minister or every other minister that retires from public life, you've got diaries, series 1 diaries, the second edition. I think Ben had 6 editions of his diary. So it does seem to be a bit of a pattern that you don't get here so much. And I think more recently, the text message exchange between Dominic Cummings and the current Prime Minister in the UK is something that I think that is probably quite alarming for a lot of the folks that would have regular interactions with ministers through text messages or WhatsApp or what have you. So, I mean, you could have written an academic book. You could have written something that was published by Pearson, but you wrote kind of like a guide in second person. So how did you arrive on that sort of format? People have made the comparison. Paul Wells in his review of the book and his kind of article on the discussion you had, kind of I think he was one of the first to point out the comparison to Machiavelli's The Prince. So. How did you land on that format to bring your content?
Yeah, it was a kind of a triggering event. I was aware of the Gordon Oswald Destin article, which I think a lot of people have read. Published around 1988, styled as a letter to a friend who has become a cabinet minister. And it's in that second person style, advice directly to somebody on what it is to be a minister. So I was aware of that in the back of my head. And it was actually just literally an aha moment when I saw my daughter struggling with writing an essay on the prince. And this whole format of mirrors to princes, Machiavelli is only the most famous example, but there's a long tradition of them. Of advice on statecraft, as it was called, to leaders of republics and princedoms, and I just thought, okay, this is something maybe I could do. I tried it out to see if I could write a few chapters in that style, and it just seemed to flow. And UBC was interested in it. UBC Press has been wonderful. Big shout out to them. And one of the reasons it was fun to work with them is they do have an academic press and can reach into the political science and public management faculties and so on. But they also have a general imprint, into the wider public. And we were able to bring the book to production very quickly. It was a very positive experience.
Yeah, and when we think about the prince, of course, there are some provisos or maxims, and right before, we were talking about the other book that you'd been reading around the time, Jonathan Powell's The New Machiavelli. So, are any of those provisos particularly, timeless, and is it better to be feared than loved if you can't be both? Are there others that stood out to you?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't try to map out directly, chapter by chapter, and I think Machiavelli has been kind of, shorthanded and soundbited to, Machiavellian as an adjective without really understanding the content. The idea of giving direct advice on the practical aspects, don't try to be an ideal ruler, but here's what it would take to be an effective ruler in a dangerous time, I think is still a formula that that can be useful. There are lots of people who can write the how things ought to be, and I encourage them. I'm not critical of that. In fact, there are dozens of op-eds published every week, and lots of academics working on it, and journalists and advocates on how things ought to be. Go for it. The only niche I can add is a fairly close-up look at how it actually is, and there's some kind of narratives or tropes in Canada, which I do challenge in the book. Doesn't make everybody happy, but they're kind of these tropes of the all-powerful PM, the all-powerful PMO, ministers are nobodies, they're sheep, they're blindly obedient, nobody 50 meters from Ottawa, from Parliament Hill matters. They've sort of sunk into our background noise. And they're just not the government that I worked with, several governments over several decades. And so I wanted to challenge that, the idea that cabinet is some kind of focus group for an all-powerful PM, or that everything's pre-cooked before it gets to the table. None of those things are true. So I wanted to shed some light on the core thing about Canadian government, which is cabinet government, the Westminster system. For me, the better question, as the lawyers put it, is not about the sort of the power of the PM. And don't get me wrong, the Prime Minister is always the most powerful person in the room. Prime is right in the in the title. And we should be careful who we choose as our Prime Minister or as a party leader and would-be Prime Minister. But the more interesting question, which I try to open up a bit, is why do some ministers become very impactful and effective and others not so much? What is it differentiates an effective minister from a less effective minister? And I think that's the topic I try to explore.
Yeah.
We've had a lot of new ministers, right? I mean, we've had, well, I think I counted it once, I think since the 2011 election. First of all, I think we've had 4 federal elections, but we've taken about 70 people out of other walks of life, taken them to Rideau Hall, sworn them in and said, congratulations, you're a cabinet minister now, without a lot of preparation on what it is, to do the job. A lot of them don't even really have more than a vague idea what the job is, and then suddenly they're asked to do it, right away. So I wanted to get into that, sort of what ministers do all day. Most Canadians will see the Prime Minister and cabinet ministers very intermittently. They'd be lucky if 45 seconds of a question period exchange shows up, on the nightly news, or maybe some pre-cooked event of some sort. But they work hard 7 days a week, and I wanted to open up a little bit what they do all day and all week.
Yeah, I mean, let's dive into the deputy minister role, and at the Institute of Public Administration, we're really keen to understand the role of the deputy minister of public servants more generally. And so when you think about the book, it really is structured, part 1, advice to the Prime Minister, part 2, advice to the minister, part 3, advice to the deputy minister. So the role of the deputy minister, I think some of us understand it, but a lot of Canadians wouldn't know what a deputy minister is. What is I guess we can skip maybe what is a deputy minister, but what makes an effective deputy minister? What are the attributes required to be a high-performing deputy minister today?
Yeah, well, I think I would pause a little bit on, what is a deputy minister? I was in that community for about 17 years and saw lots of my colleagues as well. What I don't try to address all of that in the book. There's lots of roles a deputy minister plays, and chiefly they are the main administrative officer, and they're accountable for the finances and the human resources and the information management systems, and for the basic business processes and services that their organization delivers. So first and foremost, it's competent execution and delivery of whatever it is that you do, whether it's food inspection or regulatory process or pandemic response or infrastructure and so on. So a lot of it is management and leadership. And those are topics, which I know IPAC's has explored and is very interested in. And good deputies, I would say, first and foremost, have to be good at those parts of the job. Some of the deputies, not all of them, because they're deputy level jobs running, correctional services or the RCMP or different agencies and so on. There are over 300 federal entities, about 70 deputy minister level jobs. About 20 of them have a very direct relationship with the minister. And so that's really all I focus on, is if that's what it takes to do the minister's job, where does the deputy fit in? So that's a long, sort of a long way to get to the point, which is, what I try to get across, and not everybody's happy with this either, is your main job is to make sure that the minister is successful. The minister is the accountable person with a democratic mandate. The big choices about what to do are made through elections and legislatures. And so, when a government comes in and says, I'll use examples I'm familiar with, but there are ones rolling off the speech from the throne yesterday. We're going to legalize cannabis. Then it's not the deputy's job to say, well, sir, I disagree with that. That's a damn fool thing. You shouldn't do it. You get into a dialogue about how to get there and what are the considerations, the reaction of the Americans. How are we going to do the safety inspection? What kind of enforcement regime? Will there be breathalyzers or blood tests? There are so many sort of issues that had to be worked through on something relatively simple as legalizing cannabis, which the Germans, by the way, committed to do today. So, whether if to have a carbon price or not have a carbon price is largely settled by elections now, right? So a lot of the policy part of the public service role is about how to get there. And it's a due diligence role. There's a lot of the electoral commitments are pretty vague. We're going to, do things better. And there's a lot needs to be sort of worked through in a very dense middle ground of tactical issues and implementation and delivery issues of how to get there. And often there are lots of choices along the way about how to get to, where you want to go. Governments in Canada come in usually relative, not that many really specific commitments and promises, but they do often come in with a view which sort of anchors them on the role of government in the economy and society. We've had governments that are more expansive and more small government in orientation, and that's the lens through which they'll see issues. And in Canada, there's a very strong federalism lens that some governments just instinctively, federal governments, instinctively say, well, there's something we can get involved. And other governments have come in and said, whoa, wait a minute, is that a federal thing, or do we leave it to provinces and local governments and play a more, supportive role? And that becomes a lens with which they would see an issue like climate or whatever the issues are. So, there's a role there in supporting the democratic process, and bringing things to fruition. There's an enormous amount of policy advice coming in. It comes in from stakeholders, from journalists, from think tanks, from all kinds of sources about what to do. And the real value add, I stress, that the public service functions, the public service can do that nobody else can do, is sift and synthesize and sort and turn it into actionable choices where, your 100 hours of cabinet time can turn them into decisions and actions. There's plenty of rhetoric out there. It's action. And for me, governing is about taking decisions and, democratically mandated people taking decisions on our behalf. And so turning aspirations and rhetoric and pressure and crisis into actionable choices. That's really, where the public service comes in that nobody else can do.
Yeah. One of the themes that comes up kind of periodically, and we'll get to time a little bit later, is the idea of pair bonds. The kind of relationship and the dynamics between the deputy minister and the minister. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit on pair bonds? What are they? What is the art that kind of goes into making those sorts of matches?
Well, it's more art, and it's not always entirely successful. I mean, some of it is just I try to capture a little bit of this. There is a turnover of ministers that's driven by the political cycles, elections, and career flame outs, and all sorts of things. So ministers come and go. I think if you look at the list of ministers on Wikipedia, some of them are there like 1 or 2 years. 3 would be a lot. 5 would be a ton, like 2 mandates. So they will move around from department to department. They may stay a minister a while, but they may do 3 or 4 things. So there's that cycle of turnover of ministers. And underneath it or beside it, there's a parallel turnover of deputy ministers who tend to, sort of their mean duration in job is about 3 years. So the probabilities are at some point, a deputy is going to get a new minister, a minister is going to get a new deputy. And so these pair bonds, as I put them, they tend to last about 2 or 3 years. They can be great while they last. And then, the minister's shuffled or the minister resigns or the deputy's asked to move to another job. So it's this kind of, and really that's one of the roles the clerk plays, and the prime minister's chief of staff on the political side is trying to get these bonds as good as they can be, and you it's an imperfect science to say the least, but that's one of the things I also try to get across in the book. I'm jamming a lot of things into these questions, but when you're sitting in the prime minister's chair or the clerk's chair, it's a portfolio. It's 30 assets. Let's, to use a round number. And not all the ministers are as strong as each other. And from the clerk's perspective, you're trying to match up. You're developing deputies. You have senior deputies, new deputies, deputies that are better at policy, deputies that are better at services and operations. And so you're playing, matching as best you can. This minister needs this kind of deputy, and so on. You don't always get the pairs that you want, and you start. If you're clerk, you're working on that portfolio of deputy ministers, from the day you start to the day you leave. If you're prime minister, and I try to get across that in the book, your first cabinet probably has a shelf life of about 6 months before somebody resigns or has to move, and you start making personnel changes. The cabinet that I attended the swearing in of 2015, I think half of them had gone within, by the end of the first mandate. So there's a lot of personnel management, I guess, would be the short form.
Yeah, and the average career of a deputy minister being 3 years, that's really striking. And I'm thinking of we've got a deputy in Nova Scotia who was quite beloved, Paul LaFlèche, and I think he became a deputy before 2003. So he's helping drive up that average. And
that's in one job, and I pushed the numbers up because I stayed at Indigenous Affairs for 8. So that pushed, and there are plenty of people that get to 8, 9, 10 years as a deputy minister in the federal system, but that's usually after doing 2 or 3 assignments.
I picked on him a little bit because he's also the president of IPAC right now. But so I think that's a really helpful explanation of kind of pair bonds and the considerations that you have as kind of clerk and it making the recommendations to the prime minister on appointing different.
And so there are other personnel dynamics, and I try to get across how much of this is about interpersonal and human relations. So the minister will have a deputy minister and a chief of staff. They may not get along or work effectively together. When it works, it's great. Then you have a triangle of the minister, chief of staff, and deputy, and you get a lot done. But that relationship isn't automatically a good or productive one, and it can break down. You have group dynamics within cabinet. There's just a group of people, the same political tribe or stripe that got elected together. They may or may not like each other. They may not be able to work effectively together. They have a common interest that keeps them going, but there are dynamics between ministers that become an issue. Sometimes the relationship between the minister and the deputy minister can break down. It can deteriorate. There's a lack of confidence, and those are other things. Other aspects of what the clerk does is you have to be very attentive to all these human dynamics that are going on. We had a few issues between cabinet ministers, when I was cabinet secretary, where you end up playing a bit of a mediation and coaching role, trying to do some dispute resolution and keep the ministers working together. So.
Yeah, and you describe in the book the balance between the deputy minister, the chief of staff, the minister, the center, the public service, not being too politicized, but also not being deaf to political concerns. Has the book been received differently by the different groups? I think about my copy of the book. I got a copy of the book, gave it to a friend. She recently became a chief of staff to a minister, and she said, the tradecraft of politics. What's Michael Wernick doing writing about politics? Isn't he a public servant? So have you noticed a different reaction from the elected
That's one of the, that's a very deliberate choice of title, because I think governing it's the place in a democratic system where these things come together. And I don't believe there's this sort of antiseptic world of the public service and then this sort of grimy world of politics. Democratic politics is where they come together. and I try to get across some of that. So, I'm trying to get across what governing is all about. The partisanship in politics is about, winning elections, going out there, knocking on doors and doing all the dark arts of election campaigning and getting a mandate. And there are other people that know that business and can talk and write about it and do. But I was the guy there to congratulate them when they won. And it's like, okay, now you've got power. What are you going to do with it? And a lot of governments stumble at that point because they've perfected the mindsets and the skills of winning elections, and they haven't thought about governing. Yeah. And so I'm trying to make a contribution a little bit on from my point of view. There's a lot of coverage of what happens in Ottawa and in government that is seen through the lens of, will this make the government more popular? Will they go up or down in the polls? Is their re-election more or less likely? As if the purpose of governing is to win elections. I'm firmly of the view the purpose of winning elections is to be able to govern, to take those decisions and bend the arc of history of the country. It's a rare privilege. There are 38 million Canadians, right? 1 in a million gets to sit at the cabinet table. Only 338 get to sit in the House of Commons. And they have the legal mandate and the ability to make laws and policies and regulations and negotiations and have an enormous impact on the rest of it. So I wanted to, and one of the things I want to get across is every minister matters or has the potential to matter. Being in the room is different than not being in the room. And whether it's the caucus of MPs or the cabinet table, and all of the sort of the processes that lead upstream towards a cabinet meeting, being a minister matters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it is, I think you're right, a lot more than a beauty contest. Going back to kind of ministers and deputies and that relationship again, the pair bonds, not many of us get to see what's happening in those meetings behind the scenes. I think, one of the cultural demonstrations of that was that old 40 plus years ago series Yes Minister, which had kind of the permanent secretary and the minister. That happened a long time ago, and it's really based on probably things that happened in the 1970s. So, fictional series, but it seems to kind of come up again and again, and it remains popular, and it hasn't been forgotten. And so, in what ways, is it totally fiction versus, is there a little bit of documentary in that series, in those relationships?
Well, we could go, we could go through all of the various versions of House of Cards, UK and US and Borgen and, Secret City. There's lots of political dramas in the thick of it and so on. They all have some aspect of realism in that, they picked up some aspect of what it's like inside, but they're, for dramatic effect. Maybe they capture how much, the personalities matter, which is something I do agree with, the frailties and the quirks of people. I've said this before on other occasions. The view of deputy ministers or senior officials, mandarins as they're often labeled, is a peculiar one, because, in the same day you can be accused of being manipulative, behind the scenes, yes minister, calling the shots and what happens. But also you can be attacked for being too subservient and obedient and toadies of the government of the day. Well, which is it? Are we too obedient or are we too manipulative? It's hard to see how we could be both, as Schrodinger's deputy minister, as I said at a Senate committee once. So, it's a dynamic process. I do try to get across what governing feels like for a lot of these people. And it really boils down to this sense, which you notice when you leave, and you notice when you come in, you notice when you leave, that you are continuously multitasking with imperfect information and a sense of being hurried and imperfect forecasts of what's going to happen if you do this versus that. And you would always love to have more time, and you would always love to have more information and more analysis, but you don't. You can't. You've got to move on. You've got about 100 hours of cabinet time, and you may have 200 to 300 decisions to make every year, and that's barring some major thing like the BC, floods or a global pandemic or, the Megantic crash. A lot of governing is driven by reactivity to, crisis management and emergency management, which is something Canada does really, really well. But part of the art of governing is not just being reactive to that, but staying on course on the core things that, the government said it would do, whether it's, climate change or growing the economy or what to do with China or Indigenous reconciliation. Can you keep making progress on the big drivers of your government while being good at something like the BC floods?
Yeah, and I think it probably is the right time. Time is ticking on, and we are going to go to questions. And I see we've got lots of questions across the country already. Shane Jaffer, Wayne McGill, Martin McKinnon, Todd Brown, and Shane's got one more. So now's the time.
I'll let you do the umpiring.
Now's the time to start getting your questions in. And I'll just do kind of one more on the topic of time, Michael.
Sure.
Time and the lack of it seems to be the theme that really stuck out. Maybe two more questions. It's the recurring theme in the book. And you mentioned the finite amount of time of cabinet hours, and then you've got to structure agendas for that. How do governments and senior leaders not let time slip through their fingers? How do they best take advantage of it and get the most done that they can in time? What are some helpful kind of tips and tricks that you've found that
well, I think you have to spend $20 and buy the book to get the full package, frankly. But I mean, there are two aspects to that. One is as an individual, and one is as a group, as a government, a collectivity. So, and I try to explore both of those, as you mentioned. For a minister, from the day you start to the day you leave, you just have this feeling of being pressed and hurried, and every decision, there are more people to meet, more places to go, more things to read, more meetings to attend, more invitations than you can possibly, you start having to say no to a lot of things. And every choice that, I'm going to go here or spend an hour there is a choice not to do something else. And so, I think I go into some of the trade craft of keeping a grip on and being, as proactive and mindful of these choices as possible, having really good people around you and so on. And really that is the message is, the mindful management of your time is probably one of the 2 or 3 fundamental skills of being effective, because if you just drift and react and, answer the last person who talked to you is the one who gets the meeting and so on, and you're not sort of mindful about what you want to do with your time over months and so on, you're not going to be effective. I mean, then you'll find, oh geez, 2 years has gone by and I didn't do the things I thought I was going to do, and it's election time or I've been moved to another job. So I think mindful time management is really a key skill for a minister. And a prime minister for that matter. As a group, I just try to get a little bit about the simple arithmetic of it, which is they tend to meet about once a week during sitting weeks of the House for about 3 hours, sometimes a bit more, sometimes a bit less. You can sometimes squeeze in an extra meeting. So you can supplement that with some retreat style meetings in the off weeks, but it's probably about 100 hours of cabinet table time for everything from agriculture to veterans. And how to use that time well is something that prime ministers quickly realize. They wish they had more time together, but there are all these other pressures on them, which I try to go through, and all these other pressures on the other ministers. So optimizing, to use that term, is really part of what I want to. And I do try to go through how a prime minister, as the first minister in cabinet, can try to make better and more mindful use of cabinet time, for sure. But, it's one of these things where you never feel satisfied. You always leave a meeting wishing you'd had more time. You always feel, and there was a constant complaint by ministers when they get in retreat format, how come we can't have more deliberative discussions? Everything seems to be so transactional. And everything that you do to lean against it and give them more quality deliberative time helps. But there's, you always feel a little bit dissatisfied that you wish you had more time. And that's just one of those, that would be one of my maxims.
I wish I had more time as well. So I'll get to some of the questions coming in now. So I'll just kind of pop this one up on the screen, Michael. So question from Martin McKinnon, and Martin, I know, is in Nova Scotia. He says, and this is one that comes up, periodically in, the newspapers. The bureaucracy grew by 6%, while the Privy Council grew by 11% over a 10-year period from 2010 to 2020. And he also says that increasingly the bureaucracy is located more and more in Ottawa. Is this a problem? Is it true? Is this a problem? And does this need to change?
Well, I don't know about whether it's true or not. You can go on GC Infobase and look that up. There's everybody in IPAC should bookmark GC Infobase and fact check that, in terms of where the jobs are. I think I saw some evidence that the cuts that resulted from the 2012 deficit reduction exercise landed heavily on some of the services and operations, and that landed more outside of the NCR. But it's roughly 40% NCR, 60% outside of the NCR, basically. That may change a little bit. I do think, I've said this in other fora, that post-pandemic, as ministers figure out that location matters less, people can do all kinds of service delivery and back office and other kinds of jobs from any location, that the argument of you need to be in Ottawa near the minister is less and less tenuous, or less and less, credible, more and more tenuous. I think whoever the government is over the next 10 years, they will start picking up pieces and moving them outside of Ottawa out to other cities. And there's a simple reason for that. Of the 38 ministers, only 1 or 2 are ever going to be from the NCR. Everybody else is going to say, ooh, that would be a nice thing to put in Regina. That would be a nice thing to put in Halifax. That would be a nice thing to put in Shediac or, wherever. So I think actually there's a lot of pull from the political side to decentralize and spread, especially services and operations and call centers and processing centers and so on out across the country. And so I think you're actually going to see a wave of decentralization, to use that term, whether it's red or blue over the next 10 years, is one of the post-pandemic sort of things. PCO, I just be careful about your comparators. It's not like any other department. One of the things that prime ministers do, and everyone's had a different attitude to it, is they may say, this is important to me personally, I'm going to add it as a secretariat or team at PCO. Mr. Martin, in particular, was a fan of that. He had an Indigenous Affairs Secretariat. He had a Canada-US, Secretariat, and so on. Prime Minister Harper got rid of those, but he added one on border issues after a summit with President Obama. So their large pieces get added and subtracted to the core functions of PCO. Part of the growth has been in the security and intelligence area. It's larger than it was 10 years ago because the world's a lot more dangerous place. And the Prime Minister spends a lot more time on security intelligence issues than 10 years ago.
Yeah, great. Thanks for the question, Martin. Another question here, Michael, from Ingrid Bergman. Can you talk about the value of political acumen? So understanding the intersection between politics and the bureaucracy for aspiring senior public sector leaders. Is that something that they really need to be skilled in? If they're not, how do they brush up maybe?
Yeah, I think I struggle to sort of put this across effectively, so bear with me. Because I'm accused of advocating a very politicized public service. That's not what I mean. I think you have to just define your terms a bit more carefully. You should stay away from partisanship. And one of the things I say in the book is, that senior public servants, all public servants, should stay away from partisan politics. And there's ways to do that. And equally, political staffers should stay away from the administration of departments and stop mucking around in contracting and staffing and operational issues and certainly regulatory processes, whether this drug gets approved or not. And so we have in Canada buffered a lot of the administrative delivery side of government from partisanship. The days of, we'll only pave your road if you vote for us are fading in most parts of the country.
Bottle
So,
of rum was
you know,
popular.
it's really I think we're talking about the advice function, really. You know, is the advice politicized? My view, and I'll try to answer the question, is political acumen means understanding the world of politicians and their incentives and disincentives and drivers and perhaps how they spend their time and, you know, what it's like to be a minister or a political staffer. Understanding their world doesn't mean crossing over. It doesn't mean that you have to start doing their job or thinking like them. And, you know, I think understanding the triangle and knowing, you know, that it's a legitimate, important part of our democracy to have strong political offices around ministers, and there are things that they can do that public servants can't and shouldn't do. And, you know, so I find a lot of it's oversimplified. You know, the political staffers have a very, you know, sort of dim view of the public service sometimes, and public servants have a very dim view of political staffers. I think both of them are important and need to be professionalized and respected and developed.
Yeah. Thanks, Ingrid. Question from Ethan. So Ethan is tuning in with his classmates and professor. Tell us which school you're in, Ethan. And so he has a question about you know, advice. And this is probably the most popular question you would get as clerk and maybe as deputy too, but curious how that maybe your answer might have changed over the past couple of years. But what advice do you have for new public servants?
Ooh, I feel a burden that I might be sort of messing up somebody's life or career with this, but let me give it a shot. This may sound a bit odd, but I mean, what my common answer to this is don't over-focus on Ottawa, as per the previous question, or even the federal government. The public sector in Canada, as IPAC knows, is very broad and covers, you know, really important roles in provincial, territorial, you know, municipal and Indigenous governments. And there are many ways to make a difference. Some of the most important issues of our day, and the pandemic would have brought them to light, whether it's climate change adaptation or Indigenous reconciliation and natural resource management or public health or childcare, they're delivered by provincial governments by and large, or by their extended public sector. I think some of the most interesting issues in the 2020s are going to be in that extended public sector: court systems, policing, emergency management, universities, colleges, school boards. That's public sector as well. And the skills of public management that you're learning there may be very useful to the city of Halifax or the province of New Brunswick as much as to Ottawa. So don't over-focus on, you know, it's easy for me to say because I spent most of my career, you know, in the policy stream, and a lot of it, you know, all of it essentially in Ottawa. But, you know, think national. The other thing is everything's international now. So, you know, having a sensitivity to global trends and events, you could be working in, I don't know, a school board, and then suddenly all these kids arrive from Syria, and you've got an issue, you know, in your school board about how to accommodate and instruct and bring them in. So the world brings issues to Canada all the time. And certainly, you know, the big issue of this generation will be climate, right? So Indigenous reconciliation is not just an Ottawa thing. There's a lot you can do in provincial and local and municipal governments to move reconciliation forward. So I guess one of the differences that I would say is, you know, my generation was educated and raised in the shadow of the Cold War between the West and the Soviet bloc, or the communist bloc, however you want to put it. And that kind of defined all kinds of issues for, you know, 30 or 40 years. I think for the next 20, 30 years at least, a lot of what happens is going to be defined by, you know, a meta struggle between the West and China. And so I would read everything I could about China, you know, their history, their politics, how things work. I think that, you know, a deep understanding of China is probably fundamental to doing work in public policy and public admin over the next 20 years.
Yeah. Interesting question from Ottawa here, and this one came in through email.
Yeah.
But it's not a federal public servant, I can tell you that. So it kind of falls into your broader tent of public servants. So this one's interesting because it touches on social media, and I think you were very vocal about some of the attacks in social media. The question is, in this era of polarization and sensationalist politics and social media, there can be times when a public servant can get into a Twitter spat, and I don't know, but your feed, Michael, if you've got a Twitter account, I know you're very active on LinkedIn, but mine is full of journalists, right? So it doesn't take much for a comment to become a news story. What is the appropriate response for let's think about like a junior public servant or a mid-career public servant when their integrity gets, called into question, maybe by a journalist or an elected official? And what is how does that play out, right? Can they respond? Do they have to, does everything have to go through the department and the comms people? Like, increasingly more of our life is happening out in the open, and these sorts of landmines can erupt. So what should a public servant consider when they're considering responding in that kind of public forum?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm in a position to give any really concrete advice on that. I've been out for a couple of years, and my last jobs were at the deputy level, where you experience these things very, very differently, and you are visible. And I think that is part of the contract and the deal of being in a very senior position, as you are a public face and a public spokesperson for your organization. It's unfortunate that the world of bullying and attacks and abuse that started with politicians, mainly female politicians, has kind of spread. And we've seen public health officials attacked during the pandemic, and we've seen others attacked. And there's been a kind of a willingness to use public servants as pawns or footballs in some kind of partisan exchange at a parliamentary committee, which I pushed back on when I could. I think each organization is going to have to develop a kind of protocol. There's a code of values and ethics in the public system, in the federal system, which might be helpful. And there are sort of guidelines on use of social media in most departments. There's a blurry line between your role as an individual and the hat you wear as a public servant. Go back to the comment about staying out of partisanship. I find Twitter a complete sort of, toxic waste of time and don't participate in it, but that's a personal choice. Others can make, different choices and so on. It's not the most productive, to live and learn and engage, in your country anyway. So that'll be part of my background. But what to go back to the book, I think there's an unfortunate kind of price to this turning politicians into targets of abuse. And when you couple the fact that these are really hard grinding jobs, and after you've done them for 3 or 4 years, and the price that it takes on your personal life and your health and your family, and then you add the amount, the element of abuse to it and very little positive feedback, a lot of politicians get to the point where they say, maybe it's time I go back and do something else and resume another career or get out of it. So I think we will find the shelf life of elected politicians gets shorter. Hopefully we can deal with the more extreme examples that we saw in, murdered member of parliament in Britain and physical attacks in Canada and so on. And that's an issue for law enforcement. And it's a bigger topic than I can address it.
Yeah. Got a question here from one of Ethan's classmates, and we learned it's University of Ottawa. So welcome, Leslie and Ethan and Charles Beaudry. I can see Charles is there too, and the whole class. So Leslie's question, speaking of international, and this is an evergreen topic as well, Michael. Yeah. So, open government was the name of the very first episode of Yes Minister in 1980. Yeah. Speaking, what are your thoughts on the move for open government and open data?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been a proponent of transparency and as much of the outputs and even intermediate parts of government that can be put out there, the better. I thought the open data initiative that, started getting momentum in the UK and the US was something that we should emulate. Scott Bryson showed an enormous amount of leadership on this when he was Secretary of the Treasury Board, or President of the Treasury Board, sorry. So, I'm pro-transparency. I guess, to make it more interesting, I mean, what's interesting is if you're a journalist, you think the entire edifice of our democracy rests on the Access to Information Act and a sort of, request-based model. I want to see this record. Can I get it or not? And I participated in a debate on the future of access to information legislation back in September, which you can find with a bit of clicking and searching. But I think my view on it is, yeah, an access regime is a request-based model is important, but proactive disclosure is better. Open government's better. Open data sets are better. An institutional oversight from about 14 officers and agents of parliament checking on, on government. There are over 2,500 people working for offices of parliament, checking the homework of the executive branch all the time. That's not a complaint. It makes us better. So, that sort of feedback and oversight loop, proactive disclosure and transparency, and an active and vigorous media and journalism, it makes for a healthy democracy for sure. So, I think more transparency is generally better. The line I draw in the book is it stops at the door of the cabinet room. I disagreed in the debate. The idea that cabinet should be sort of open like a municipal council, I vehemently disagree with. I think it would change the nature of the conversations, it would change the power relationships. A lot of the influence that ministers have, the reason it isn't just a focus group is they know they can speak up in caucus and cabinet without retribution and without their views, immediately turning into a media sensation, and there are factions and splits within cabinet and so on. There's a lot of candor and dialogue and exchange within caucus and within cabinet, precisely because those conversations are confidential. People feel they can ask tough questions, they can take unpopular positions, they can push back against the prime minister, and the team's solidarity is maintained. So I actually think it's, the cabinet secrecy is part of the essential, success of cabinet government.
Yeah. Terrific. And thanks, Leslie, for your question. So time is not just an issue for prime ministers and ministers and deputies. It's an issue for us as well. My very last question, Michael. The book's been out for about a month. Everybody on the line should buy it, and they will get an email, and they've got an email with a discount code. So if you buy it from UBC Press, of course, you do get 30% off, which is terrific. This might not age well, but it is Black Friday this weekend, so a great stocking stuffer for any public servant, or political staffer or minister. People may have the problem of getting multiple copies. My last question, Michael, is now that you've done a few interviews, you've heard from old colleagues, you've heard from. You've gotten feedback from a lot of people. What do you wish you maybe added to the book, or what's something that you maybe didn't consider when you were writing, but you've thought, maybe the second edition might benefit from.
Well, that's a terrific question. I appreciate that. I have done about 15 or 20 sort of interviews and sessions like this, so I've had a fair bit of feedback. I think if I was to do it all over again, and if I get a chance to sort of add to it, I would have made more of the role of the Minister of Finance and the budget process. I referred to it, but I don't really dig into the fundamental importance of the budget, which is proven this week. The speech from the throne is all nice and good, but the real decisions about the government's priorities are set in the budget in a few months. So I would have talked a bit more about that. I think I would have explored the role of the deputy minister a bit more, as per your questions. Today, I think I would have talked a bit more about the multifaceted nature of the deputy minister role. So there are things that I would certainly add to. I think what a lot of people focus on the startup elements, and the book is almost written as a startup manual. A new minister shows up or a new prime minister shows up, and it has that kind of feel, which I'm happy with because I took part in 3 transitions and 3 startups. But I think if I write any more about it, I'll focus a bit more on the late and end game stages of the government as well. What's it like to be prime minister in your twilight? When the power is ebbing away and your successors are nipping at your heels. I think I would add a bit more on the cycle of a government from birth to death.
Yeah, terrific. Okay, well, I guess we'll all just have to wait and read the first iteration and then buy the next version of the book in 5 or 6 years. But,
the nice thing about poli-sci students is they keep making new ones.
Just like ministers. Okay, well, thank you so much, Michael. Jennifer, I'll hand it back over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Michael and Matt, and to everyone. That's all the time we have. So on behalf of IPAC Nova Scotia, we hope you enjoyed this event and want to thank everyone for their attention and participation. And of course, Matt, great job on facilitating today. And Michael, the riveting overview of your book and your time in government is something that we should all be mindful of as public servants. And of course, remember that if you haven't picked up Michael's book yet, the website has the details on how you can get it. And also, I want to put in a plug for becoming a member of IPAC if you are not a member yet. So please consider doing so. We look forward to seeing you all again soon. Good night, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Good night. Thanks, everybody.